Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And we here at Good Faith are beginning a 4-part episode on Advent. So I wanted to explain why Advent is so important for followers of Jesus to make sense of the world, especially in this moment. There is a temptation to make sense of the world by what arrives in our news feed, right? The news that arrives could be about the economy, culture, and especially these days, about politics. But the point is that the news that arrives is the thermostat. It's what sets the temperature of how we're feeling in the world. And because the modern world is subject to a number of forces that constantly accelerates change, especially via technology, this makes our experience of the world feel always changing, erratic, and unpredictable. And so living this way, where news events that arrive in our feed are the thermostat, means we're like people living in a house where someone is always unpredictably changing the thermostat. And so one moment we're too hot, another moment we're too cold, and we never know what to expect. Well, Advent reminds us to not let what arrives in our news feed serve as the ultimate thermostat. The word Advent is derived from the Latin word adventus, which means coming or arrival, which also translates to the Greek word parousia. So what Advent reminds us is that how we're supposed to make sense of the world actually has already been set. It's already been determined by 2 anchoring historical arrivals. The first Advent celebrates the first arrival of Jesus, his birth, which has already happened. And that birth declares that Jesus has already initiated the rescue of the world from all that it ails us. And then Advent also anticipates another arrival, the future arrival, which is also a historical event which will come, which will happen, and in which Jesus will fully complete the rescue of the world that he inaugurated in his first arrival. So Advent reminds us to anchor our sense of the world via these 2 events, such that we live in the in-between. We are in-between people living in in-between times, between Jesus' birth that has already inaugurated the kingdom and Jesus' future return as king that will finally fully establish the kingdom. Now, of course, as people living in between means we will be paying attention. We will be, of course, affected by the news fluctuations that happens in the in-between times. We will feel that. But in between people, in between followers of Jesus, anchor their fundamental sense of the world. They live in this world by dialing in regularly to these bookended events of Jesus' birth and return. And so as we adopt this Advent thermostat to really set how we live in this world as in-between people, we are invited in particular to reset 4 particular senses about the world that can be characterized in these 4 words: hope, peace, joy, and love. And these in the Advent liturgy are celebrated each week in the weeks leading up to Christmas, oftentimes by some liturgical practice like lighting a candle and focusing on one of these themes: hope, peace, joy, and love. And so that's how we're going these next 4 episodes, going through hope, peace, joy, and love, finishing with our last episode, love, where our guest, Andrew Peterson, will take us into what really is the highest sense that we're called to adopt. But this week, to begin the Advent series, we begin with hope, and I'm thrilled to have as our guest, leading us into making sense of the world through hope, Sara Billups. Sara Billups is a writer and cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Christianity Today, and the BBC. She writes the Substack Bitter Scroll and co-hosts the podcast That's the Spirit. She's the author of the wonderful book, Orphan Believers, and I hear she's currently putting the finishing touches on her second book, Nervous Systems. I love that title. I can't wait to hear about this. And we at Redeeming Babel were blessed to have Sara actually lead prayer during our recent pre-election prayer gathering. So Sara, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Oh, thanks, Curtis. It's so good to be here.
Well, Sara, you have a big task ahead of you because I feel like hope is so crucial for us to understand, especially in Advent. And yet it's a word that's thrown around a lot with a lot of very different and fuzzy meanings. So can you help us as Jesus followers? What does hope mean for us?
Yeah, I start by thinking about what hope isn't.
Mm.
Hope is not certainty. Hope is not ease. Hope is not necessarily comfort. But I think of what David says in Psalm 62, "Oh, my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He
Mm.
is my rock and fortress. I shall not be shaken." So I think about the promise that in the end, whatever is ahead, all things will be made well, and we can trust in confidence that our hope can be not shaken in Christ.
That's a lovely definition of hope. It strikes me as you say that hope is really a word that characterizes this in between state that I was talking about, because hope is a word that occupies this space, it seems like what you're saying, in between hope to be conflated with certainty on one end and maybe wish on the other end, where there's no substance actually to our sense of future. We're just wishing for something good. And then again, certainty, where we're like, we know for sure exactly how it is all going to get played out. And hope occupies this in between place between certainty and simply wish.
Absolutely. It's the already and not yet. It's almost like as we were talking, I was imagining kind of this bridge in between, which very much
Mm.
speaks to our present moment and I think can apply to our own personal life and what's going on. And also, of course, geopolitically or nationally, or looking at what's happening in the wider world.
Yeah. Well, and it's actually captured biblically, sort of, I think, beautifully, Hebrews 11:1, when it says faith, the Christian faith, is the assurance of things hoped for, conviction of things not seen, right? So we don't have the certainty of having seen things visibly right before our eyes that we can know with absolute certainty. And yet we actually have the assurance of something, this future return of Jesus, that is the assurance of our hope. So that's a beautiful way to think about this as in between people. Now, Sarah, you've said that your writing is meant to encourage young and midlife Christians to claim a wholehearted identity in Jesus. I love that phrase, claim a wholehearted identity in Jesus. And your audience are young and midlife Christians. So I want you to help us unpack that with these two audiences, the young and the midlife. Let's start with the young. What are the challenges for young Christians in living as hopeful people?
So I think that first, there are people that struggle with the church, even if they're drawn to Jesus. And second, there's people that are distancing themselves from Christianity in general because of what they see in politics or culture wars. And so there's just a lot of disillusionment and a lot of faith crisis. And that's, of course, across the board. But I'm seeing that so much in young people. I just, the night of the election, was on a Zoom call with some folks just talking out a little bit about our experiences. And there were a couple of young people on the call that voiced that they were living under the same roof in a home with parents that had voted differently. And so they were even in a space that should be of rest, feeling this palpable tension. And so there's certainly this kind of generational tension as well when I think about what's happening with young people and faith. And, I'm in my mid 40s, but as the mother of a kid that's a teenager, I'm just kind of seeing him enter into these worlds of questions and of the draw of culture and how that can be really refreshing, and it can be a creative time and a time of expression, but a real time of questioning what is good and true and what is compelling about the Christian story.
Sarah, I think that's been one of my most heartbreaking experiences as a parent, is to come into contact with my own daughter's struggle with a sense of despair about the future. Both of my daughters struggle with that. One of my daughters has said to me, she's like, I don't know if I want to have kids because, I don't know if I want to bring kids into a world that is going to be racked by climate change, that is going to be devastating and so forth. And I'm like, oh, honey, that's, I was trying to just listen, but it broke my heart. And it struck me in her particular comment about despair about the future and not wanting to have kids. I thought about Advent, because Advent is this moment that is supposed to give us hope, this historical event that's supposed to give us hope. And it's tied to childbirth. And that there's something about childbirth that is fundamentally an act of hope. I mean, specifically the childbirth of Jesus births our ultimate hope. But I think every decision to have child and every event when child comes into the world is a moment that is suffused with hope. And so it kind of makes sense in a sad way why when we feel hopelessness, we don't want to bring children into the world, right? That the childbirth and hope are these sort of, interweaving realities. And it just makes me feel like, my goodness, I mean, is this something that every generation has struggled with, or is there something about this generation in particular?
It's such a timely question. I mean, I was listening to a podcast driving home from church yesterday talking about natalism and the politics around birth rates on both sides of the aisle. And then I was listening to, or I read an article about 4B culture. It's this sort of growing movement of, I think it started in South Korea, of women that are rejecting, dating, childbirth, marriage, almost as a protest to patriarchy. And so there's this interesting broader cultural questions sort of surrounding this conversation. And, I think it's understandable thinking about the environment and climate change and what's going on, that young people like our kids might question starting a family. But I think there's this really parallel question: are humans harmful? Like, what is the purpose of human life? And I think that, as Christians, we believe that the creator of the universe took on humanity, that Jesus was born in human form. And so I think more than ever, that's a reaffirmation to me of the extreme value of humanity, that we aren't just animals, that there is divine intention. And so I feel like that answer is more compelling than relevant than ever in our current kind of cultural and political frame.
Right. So you're saying because Advent is the birth of Jesus as a fully human being in the world, that in Jesus, God, and in the first Advent, God has fully taken on human form. There's an elevation of the human, and that God's saying, I'm placing my bet on humanity, so much so that I'm adopting the human form, and that should actually give us hope. Yeah. I'm all
Absolutely.
in. Yeah. Well, that's a lovely word, maybe that I hope that the Advent season can be conveyed to the young, that in the Advent, God says, I'm all in on the human race. And therefore, you should also join me on being all in on the human race and having more humans, having us an abundance of humans in the world to bring new life into the world. That is a word I hope gets carried out in all the various Advent celebrations happening in this season. Okay, let's switch to the second audience that you really care about, the midlife Christian. I almost said midlife crisis. God, that was a Freudian slip.
I mean, it kind of applies.
Yes, exactly. Right. So let's talk about that. How would you describe, again, I know we're making generalizations there, but making generalizations, how would you describe the sense of hope for the typical midlife Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the midlife Christian is more pessimistic than Gen Z. I mean, I was at a concert in downtown Seattle last January. I looked around the room. It was this folk singer, and I think I was probably one of the oldest people there. I saw like a guy in the balcony with gray hair, Curtis, but I think I was, as a 40-something, kind of tipping the scales.
I think he was like the security guard or something like that.
He was probably on staff. Let's be right. But I was looking around and I thought, Gen Z is like, there's just something that is familiar to me, kind of like when I was coming up in the 90s and into art and ideas and going to concerts and seeing bands. I just thought everyone is so earnest and present and focused and kind of like, presenting with an interesting aesthetic or like a little weird. I felt such like love and curiosity about this generation, and also kind of a maternal instinct, realizing I was probably old enough to be most of their moms. But I just thought, I feel like there's this optimism and hope. So there may be deep questioning. Maybe Gen Z and younger is doing a deeper questioning. Is there something compelling in the Christian story? But I didn't sense a cynicism. When I think about people that are more my age, or I'm kind of a young Gen X, or think about millennials, I think about a deeper cynicism that life has not turned out how many of us either were told it would or how we hoped it might. As we move into life, and that those sort of simple promises that if we grew up in evangelicalism, we may have been told have not happened, that kind of optimism or hope for the kind of life we thought we were being given has worn off, especially as things have continued to fall apart and the churches continue to go through so many trials. And so I think that I feel a lot of cynicism and a lot of doubting and a lot of anger, a lot of emotion in my peers.
Well, it sounds like there's a kind of disillusionment with maybe how my own life has turned out. Maybe some folks even listening are wrestling with something about your career hasn't turned out the way you are. Your marriage hasn't turned, your kids haven't turned out the way you thought they would. And so there's a sense of, well, how do I hold that disillusionment? But then also maybe the prevailing institutions around us, the church, or discovering the church has been complicit in why cover up, an abuse, a complicity in political idolatry, or so forth.
Yeah.
And so there's this external disillusionment as well with institutions outside of not just how our own lives turned out. So, Sarah, if that's pervasive, then again, in this season of Advent, what is the message of Advent to midlife Christians struggling with that sense of disillusionment?
I think that the message is whatever in your life may have fallen apart or may have even been disappointing, whether there is a specific brokenness because of divorce, grief, death, loss of career, lack of security, if there's a specific thing or just a general malaise or sense that things are not what we thought they might be, I think there is a real invitation to understand what Advent hope is actually offering. Is it lip service? Is it a candle we light on a wreath? Is it something we do because it feels kind of cozy and we've always done it? Or is there really some hard beauty to be found in choosing to hope that in the end, all things will be made well, regardless of our own specific situation or circumstance? Is it even possible that in the very presence of affliction, suffering, anxiety, and then, of course, in the world, thinking about all that's happening globally right now, is there an invitation to rest in the kind of hope that Advent offers? And I think that there is.
Yeah, Sarah, it strikes me that it's important, perhaps, for somebody who is wrestling with disillusionment, is to do some wrestling in this Advent season, perhaps, with what is the disillusionment, right? So, because there could be the disillusionment means actually just that. An illusion has been dissipated, has been disabused. You've been disabused of an illusion, right? And so maybe there is actually an illusion that we held to, that we were raised with, like all churches are always good, all pastors are always reliable, or something like that. Or, the Republican Party is my party of good. I mean, I don't know, or the Democratic Party is always my party of good. Whatever that illusion we grew up with, there's a legitimate and needful process of disillusionment, perhaps that we have held about institutions, that actually needs to be confronted. And ultimately, we need to realize our hope is not ultimately in those institutions, but in our true King who will restore these institutions in the end. Then also, for our own lives, that maybe we've held kind of at what are actually our false hopes, our illusions about how our lives should turn out. Because I think about the Advent, the first Advent, the birth of Jesus, and how in many ways that punctures many illusions, right? You would not have, the expectation of the Messiah was not that the Messiah would be born as a refugee in a stable, with by parents on the run, right? And then ultimately, of course, his whole life ends with his disciples and his big crowds being disillusioned. Like, this is the Messiah, the one hanging on the cross. And there's a profound disillusionment. And so it strikes me that actually disillusionment is built into Advent. It's built into even the whole Christian narrative that Advent initiates. And that we're actually maybe called to lean into not like try to make those feelings of disillusionment go away, but actually to lean into it, to investigate it, say, what is the illusion here that I actually need to disabuse myself of?
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. I mean, that makes me think again about Hebrews 11, thinking about Abraham, Noah, Abraham, Moses. I mean, they were looking for a better country. They were looking for they were foreigners on earth. They were looking for a city with foundations that were whose architect was God. Like, thinking, boy, there is so much hope and comfort. Thinking about 700 years that, in the time of Isaiah, that God's people had to wait, going through exile and loss and grief for so long. I do find that when I think about maybe things in our lives are not what we thought they were. Maybe institutions have failed us, but there is a long line of saints that have come before us that show us that we can bear waiting. And that's something, even if we don't see it in our lifetime, that we're on the path to wholeness and restoration. And I think about that, Curtis. I think, what if I, for my whole life, am faithful, but I don't have that Anna or Simeon moment, And that's okay. Like, I think uncentering ourselves and saying, God, while I'm here, I've been put here in this time and season in my community for a reason. Like, please do what you'd like to do through me, do whatever you want to do, and just let me choose to be hopeful that it is part of something good, even if I don't get to sort of see some big event.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Anna and Simeon moment. Say more about that, for why that is obviously, or except let's play that story, because it's an Advent story, right? So say why you brought that up as a story for those of us struggling with, man, my life has not turned out the way I thought it would. Why is that an important story to reflect on this season?
I think about Simeon so much. Think about waiting your whole, so, the verse, I think, so Simeon was a righteous and devout man. He was eagerly waiting for the Messiah for a long time. The Holy Spirit was with him. But then when Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple, he was there. He held Jesus in his arms and praised God. And then there's a famous prayer where he says, let your servant die in peace. Like, I have seen your salvation. And so I think that story is so compelling when I think about hope and waiting in Advent, because there was this kind of, like, if it was a narrative, that's the climax. There's this end, there's this moment. It's almost like an embodiment of what we would hope to see. We would hope to come to pass, even if we maybe we will, or maybe we won't. But it just, to me, brings this kind of constant reminder that people have seen God's salvation, and that is enough. And we long to see, and we hope in seeing that salvation on this side of heaven, or we know we will on the other. And to me, that just is consistently, and that's enough hope for a lifetime, honestly.
Well, actually, I like that phrase, hope for a lifetime, because Simeon's story is his whole life, he's longing to see the arrival of the Messiah. He's been waiting for that. And here at the end, practically near the end of his life, he knows he's at the end. He's an old man. Finally, that he catches a glimpse, and even that is a partial glimpse, right? It's just the promise of what can happen. He's not actually witnessing even the actual arrival of the Messiah. He's just been given a sign. Yep, it's coming. It's coming soon. But to wait your whole lifetime for that, and then only at the end, that is a profound. That's a profound act of hope, to actually live your whole life ardently hoping for something, yearning for it. He's a chief priest, right? He's orienting himself to that life. He's making choices to orient his life to that, and it only happens right at the end. I think that's so important. And the other story you mentioned when you were talking about earlier was Abraham and Sarah from Hebrews 11, right?
Yes.
It's another example of them waiting until very near the end of their life for the promise of descendants, for the promise of children, for the promise of childbirth that only comes near the end. And I think that's actually it's very challenging for those of us who are in midlife, because I think maybe just speaking for myself and for my friends that I know, like, one of the challenges of midlife is, actually midlife, frankly, is a bit of a misnomer for it's like somebody, me in my 50s. I'm actually past midlife. I mean, that's a euphemism to say, like, actually, in terms of productive life, I'm at the tail end. I mean, or not, maybe not the tail end, but I'm on the downslope. I'm on the last third, if I am lucky, if I am blessed, and to live the life of an 80-year-old or something like that. And so I think that's part of the despair, right? Of that is a challenge, is the sense that time is running out in our life. Time is running out, and all the dreams, hopes, wants that we've had in our lives haven't come true and may not come true because the clock is running out. The sands are running out on the hourglass. And Advent is this reminder to us that said, no, time never runs out. It's never too late for God to act in a way that, again, may not even be the fullness of what you had your illusory dreams of, but still to give you some real substantive taste, like Simeon had, of this news. But it's really, boy, it's hard to live that way, right? To believe that time, there's no such thing as not enough time in God's God's world.
Yeah. And I think in this particular moment that we live in, I mean, the best part of the faith that I inherited from my mom and dad growing up in the evangelical church was that the Bible was a beautiful gift that God has given us, that it's an inerrant word of God. Like I feel like there was a real biblical foundation, but I was also intuited as a kid and teenager into my 20s, this veneer that on top of Christianity, capitalism, it was all kind of working together to make sure that we would be prosperous or okay, you know? And
Mm,
so when we run into a problem that we can't buy away or fix away or reverse the clock away, then things
yeah,
get really complicated. Culturally, the message that we can kind of optimize ourselves comes into conflict at some point. At some point, you get to the point where your body fails or something happens, and you begin to
right.
realize I've been sold something that's not actually going to satisfy me.
Mm,
So that the promise, the need for hope and Advent becomes even more relevant. And that's very
right.
much what my situation is right now as a caregiver or as a person in midlife whose body is slowly becoming, a 40 something. There's all sorts of
Yeah.
personal applications of that for me.
So let me, I think if I hear you correctly, one of the illusions that perhaps this Advent season challenges us is the illusion that following Jesus, Christianity, is actually a life optimizing move. That
Mhm.
somehow, if we follow Jesus, if we believe in God, if we attend church, our lives will get optimized in health, in our relationships, in how well our children are doing, and so forth. And so, if we pair the Christian quote hope, right, with this really what is a late consumer hope of
Yeah.
life, personal life, individual optimization. If we merge those things together, we're going to get disillusioned because actually, God is not going to promise and come through on a false promise of life optimization.
Yeah, that's
That's an
right.
illusion, and that in midlife, especially, we oftentimes encounter. Wait a minute, this I thought my life was going to turn out all awesome and everybody's going to be good
Yeah.
and prosperous, and God didn't deliver on that. And the danger there, right, is to, rather than to say, wait a minute, that was an illusion, God never promised that, I made that up, or I was sold that by a church culture or so, for that is actually to the danger seems to me to say then to just to instead make the false leap to say therefore God is not trustworthy,
That's
um,
right.
because he
Exactly.
he failed to deliver on a promise he never made. Right,
Yeah.
so
And as you're talking, I'm realizing how prosperity culture, we can say the prosperity gospel is clearly, we're not all going to get rich and be healed. Uh,
yeah.
but it is so insidious and it just works itself into our psyches in these other ways. And so there are still traces, I think, of that in a lot of us that came up in
Yeah.
a culture similar to how I did.
Sara, you have written and talked about how your sense of hope had to get reshaped from what your parents' sense of hope was, and the sort of evangelical faith you inherited from your parents. Can you describe that process more for listeners who aren't maybe familiar with your story?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana in the 80s and 90s, and my dad grew up going to temple. He's Jewish. He converted to Christianity in the 70s in a pretty extreme way. He went to a Bible study at a friend's house. He was at a low point where he and my mom had separated. He felt the Holy Spirit come on him and said that he just, as he calls it, leapt over the couch, ran to the parking lot of this apartment building, and just fell on his face and
Wow.
accepted Jesus. Like a radical conversion. My mom ended up seeing him a few months later and said she didn't recognize him, that his
Hmm.
face was different, that his countenance had just lifted, that it took her a minute. They ended up getting back together, got remarried, had me. And so the story sounds sounds pretty great. But
Yeah.
when the 80s kind of came around, I think that like a lot of American families, we were really raised on, I was raised on television and going to the mall on Saturdays and church on Sundays. I think I was very much raised as an American kid as much as I was a church kid. So there was not a lot of formation. There was a lot of
Hmm.
love, but not a lot of formation. We weren't really living differently. And then on top of
Hmm.
that, there were a lot of culture war issues. We talked a lot about the Clintons, talked a lot about abortion, talked a lot about parent advisory labels on music. There was a lot of cultural stuff that kind of set in as well.
Right.
And then another big factor in my story is end times culture. And I
Mm.
think like a lot of Gen X kids, was raised in a culture with a lot of fear,
Yeah.
being told that Jesus would come back before I could raise a
Did you have
family.
Hal Lindsey comic books? Were you raised with the end times comic books? So that's what I had.
We didn't have so you understand, Curtis. We didn't have the comic books, but it's funny. I had reread Late Great Planet Earth when I was researching Orphaned Believers, and I saw some pretty cool editions with very cool kind of 70s artwork. But unfortunately, I just had a 90s copy. But we had all sorts of paraphernalia. Yeah.
The comic book version, which depicts the whore of Babylon, was very tittillating. Let me just
I
for
bet.
a 10-year-old. Okay, so you had all that. So how did that all? What did you have to do with all of that to
Yeah.
come to your current sense of Advent hope?
Yeah. I mean, I in high school got pretty into counterculture. I was really into, like, I was reading the Beats. I was reading a lot of poetry. I was
Mm.
listening to alt rock. I kind of got into creativity, began to write, and pretty quickly differentiated myself from the kind of faith culture I was raised in.
Mm.
It wasn't
Okay.
until I went to undergrad and met my husband and a group of friends and started going to a church led by a pastor who was in the Jesus movement. This
Mm.
was in the 90s when it was kind of like a lot of church coffee houses. There was
Yeah.
kind of this, I don't know, there was some kind of movement of the Spirit back then. And a lot of people,
Yeah.
this church went from 100 people to 1,000,
Wow.
saw people get healed, saw people come to Jesus. Just a really lively time where my faith really began to feel different and differentiated from my mom and dad. Moved to Seattle 20 years ago. And that's when things got complicated. I went through a spiritual desert. I think that I landed with a lot of optimism and then realized pretty quickly the city was bigger than us. What are we doing? And that's when I began to really have to think through why I believe what I do, because Seattle is a place where if you go to church, it's probably not accidental. There is little social capital to be gained by identifying as a Christian here. And so in a
Yeah.
way, it's refreshing, because if you go to church, or you're probably not accidentally there. So it's sort of a palate cleanser in a way, but it's also a little bit isolating. So working through that process, I got to the point where I just began to be pretty serious about my faith about 10 years ago, and to really start to move into formation and other spiritual practices, and to really become quite deeply involved and invested. So it was a very slow process.
And describe how that has brought you in tension with your parents and your parents' faith.
Yeah.
What has
Yeah.
that been like?
Yeah. I mean, with my mom and dad, the thing that had to happen first for me was forgiving and being able to hold with a sense of love and curiosity some of the messages of fear that I received as a kid, which was a slow process. I'm an only child, and so my parents and I really have a friendship and a sort of special relationship. And so there's a way in which it was easy for me to talk about these things and to bring them up, but it was also scary and not fun. So, in the book, in Orphaned Believers, I write about going with my dad to the ocean. He thought that the world, he still believes that he has terminal cancer, but believes that Jesus will return before he dies. He still very much believes that. He lives out here now. My parents moved out 15 years ago. My dad one year thought that during Jewish New Year, the rapture would probably happen. And he said, Sarah, let's go to the ocean, because it would be really beautiful to be raptured at a beautiful place. And I said, Dad, that is wild. Like, do you really think, at first I was just incredulous. And then I thought, you know what? This is a great opportunity to really talk to him and to really understand. And so I drove with him to Ocean Shores, Washington, and I brought my laptop, and we, for hours, talked about everything. And Curtis,
Wow.
It was like, I feel emotional talking about it. It was a really profound time of understanding, of tenderness, of connection. And so ironically, by sort of playing along with his hope, it ended up being very healing. And so we got there, and the rapture didn't happen. We stayed about 15 minutes, in case you didn't know. We stayed about 15 minutes.
I'm glad to hear that didn't happen, because you and I are still talking to each other.
We would be in trouble.
Yeah.
But we drove back, stopped at the Dairy Queen, and got blizzards. And it was actually kind of a fun day.
My
so
goodness. Okay.
so
Yeah.
we've worked it out over the years. We've worked it out.
Well, I want to talk about this leaning into what's in our minds and hearts of our parents, because I actually think that is part of the midlife Christian and not frankly non-Christian, whether you're a Christian or not. The midlife brings you into contact not only with your own vulnerabilities and fragilities and
Yeah,
disillusionments, but also with our parents, because their lives are really at the tail end. Their bodies are really breaking down. Their minds, it's really tragically often are really breaking down.
that's right.
And being in the midlife is often being in what's classically called the sandwich generation, right? Where you are caring not just for your kids, but you're caring for your parents as they almost become like kids in terms of their vulnerability and helplessness to the world. Talk about what that's been like for you spiritually to be in that sandwich generation. What has that been like for your spiritual life?
I mean, that has been seriously hard. It has been sometimes choosing hope and being surprised by hope coming in times when it feels like it should be quite far. I mean,
Mm.
my dad was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. It's a treatable but not curable kind of blood cancer. He was diagnosed the first year of the pandemic. My mom was diagnosed with Parkinson's about 10 years ago. It's advanced
Mm.
quite quickly. She now has Parkinson's disease dementia. And so we are
Oh,
watching her body and mind unravel. And so the
yeah.
question, this sort of central spiritual question I've been holding, and I think a lot of us in this generation who may have parents that are unwell are holding is, can I watch the person I love get thrashed with disease? Like, can I watch my
Mm.
mom get thrashed with Parkinson's and yet still believe there is purpose and meaning, hope and goodness? Is that a
Yeah.
possible thing? And I have found repeatedly by God's grace and mercy that it is very much possible. And
Mm.
I think that part of that began with asking God to help reconcile or bring a sense of peace that I am watching sort of a slow degradation, that it is a anticipatory mourning and grief of their
Yeah.
loss, that essentially I cannot protect them, I can't make them better, I can't solve
Mm.
their problems, that I have to accept that we are moving towards the end and still believe that God can work and do good things in the middle of that. And it has been extraordinarily painful and a time of profound mercy and grace, I think, for all of us.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that, because you're describing something that is so very much about being in between people, the now and not yet, right? Because at one level, when you're seeing that evocative phrase, your parents being thrashed with decay and disease,
Yeah.
um, there's one anchor which is that I would want to hold on to, which is the not yet, that there is a not yet coming, that this is not the end of their story, and that even as they die and as they're heading towards death, we can look forward to the restoration of all things and the resurrection of all beings in Christ. And so, there's that. But you're also saying that even in the now, you can get glimpses of that, even
Yeah.
as they are in decay and
Yes.
disease. Can you say more? How do we look for that? Because I think for so many of us who are seeing that, we just see the decay and disease. Maybe we can kind of in our minds somewhere carve
Yeah.
out, but one day they will be resurrected. But the in between, but the now, to seeing the glimpses of that breakthrough now, it can be so hard to see that because we're just overwhelmed either with sorrow,
Yeah.
sadness, or just trying to fix the
That's right.
problem or manage the
Getting through
problem
the
in some
day.
way.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, there are two things that have happened. The first is, I think, a universal experience of many of us in community. There have been 3 or 4 times where we've been at points of, either my dad had a stroke or my mom was in the hospital. There have been a few crisis moments within the long crisis where I have just prayed the word help, where I've only
Mm.
been able to say, God, help. And every time that help has come tangibly from other people. There was a time when my dad was in a time of crisis, and my friend Amanda, who's a nurse, said, "Where are they? I'm coming." And I just,
Mm.
the amount of just tangible care and the difficulty of learning how to receive, to ask and receive for that care, that kind of care has been quite humbling. I've been quite made quite humble, and it's been quite grounding. And then
Yeah.
the second thing that happened is not predictable or something that I could catch in the bottle, but there have been times of profound mercy where So my husband, Drew, and I are both very much caring for my parents together. He is very much in it with me. My mom was in the hospital for a drug reaction. She was experiencing psychosis and hallucinations. That's been a theme that has been just quite remarkably difficult to navigate. We were driving back from the hospital over I-5, the I-5 bridge. Seattle was behind us. And we just had this sense of God being near. And in the very moment where we should have had intense emotional hangovers and have felt a sense of despair, we looked at each other, and I'll never forget the moment. We looked at each other and just said, I feel God close. Like, I feel God near in this moment. And that's something that is just a beautiful and uncommon grace. And there have been times and seasons like that. And, Kate Bowler speaks about that with her own personal cancer journey, where there was a time in the beginning where she felt so held by love that she didn't understand. My mother-in-law, for example, had a quadruple bypass, and she said, I almost didn't want to come out of the hospital. I didn't want to get better, strangely, because I felt under God's wing. Like, there's this sort of mysterious thing that can happen. And so again, I don't know if that's really that's just God's mercy that I think he can bring all of us in those moments when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Sara, I want to invite you to give some practical advice for this Advent season for, again, we're staying with midlife Christians, because one of the things about the Advent season is you're getting ready for Christmas, like the holiday season, which often takes us actually back to our family of origin, like takes us to our parents and maybe two aging parents that, it's often during the, especially if you're living further away from your aging parents, it's often the holiday season where you are confronted with, oh my gosh, in the last 6 months, they've really decayed. They've really declined, right? So I think there are going to be our listeners out there who are going to be experiencing that in the weeks to come. As you're somebody who's living in the middle of that, what advice would you give to people who really they need to be preparing themselves for this kind of experience?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is to try to take a little time before the gathering or during the trip to think about how things were before. There's a way to be nostalgic or to bring emotion that maybe doesn't need to be invited into a holiday that may not be like it used to be, or it may be that you're missing someone that has passed, but there are interesting counters in my mind to watching physical suffering in my parents, or to see my mom's mind change and for her thinking to change. There was this memory I have when I was a kid. I really wanted to dance in Jell-O. I don't know why, but she went to the grocery with me, and we got one of those sort of round molds of rainbow Jell-O and put it on the floor in the kitchen, and we stomped around in it. And it's one of the most joyful memories. And she was so joyful and so silly, and we loved music and singing. So I've been able to, in a way that feels healthy and not like I'm trying to get myself emotional, but just to remember and recall all of her, like more holistically. I would just invite folks to reflect on something like that. That really helps me sort of see the longer arc and story of our relationship, and feels really good. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Just make it, and also to just not forget to laugh. Things have been so bleak with caring and loving for my parents, but we just find ways, even together, to laugh. In even sort of ridiculous moments, like we'll go through the drive-through, someone will say something funny, and then we'll all just start losing it. So just holding on to those moments too has been quite sweet.
Sara, one of the things that's about Advent is that people celebrate it really differently. They celebrate Christmas really differently. For instance, I grew up in a household where it was just like, well, you waited until the Christmas Eve, and that's when the presents came out, and the tree, the tree was up maybe a few days before that, and boom, that happened. My wife grew up in an Episcopal tradition, much more liturgical. The Advent was really a season. There was candles, there was like calendars, there was, Bible readings each week before every meal, and so forth. You've written in your book, Orphan Believers, about actually the need for us for liturgy to recover old, established, sometimes even ancient practices. Say more why you think that's really important, and why Advent in particular is an opportunity for that.
Yeah, I think that liturgy and tradition can move us to biblical hope, for a couple of reasons. I think that the foolishness of sort of Americanism of the internet age, of our tendency to think that the current or newest or latest thing is the best, is countered by Advent letting us see the core parts of our humanity and seeing the long line of saints that have come before us that we can learn from and sort of extract wisdom from. And the other thing that is so beautiful about liturgy is that when we don't have the words, it gives us the words.
That's right.
And it is a channel for us to be formed, even if we don't know what to say. For example, sometimes my prayer has been help. Sometimes my prayer has been just looking deeper at liturgy and trying to pray alongside saints from well before and that will come well after me. And that is deeply comforting.
Right. Right. Especially if you are struggling with despair, rather than just pretend it doesn't exist, or generate words that are true, right, is to actually adopt somebody else's words. You're like adopting somebody else's hope. And I think that's a legitimate move, an important move. That's what it means to have the witness of the saints with us, is to use their words also. I love that. And I think that especially, this is where I think, especially when you are not feeling hopeful yourself because of how your life turned out or just how you're feeling yourself. This is sort of where the traditional evangelical free prayer sort of just comes up so empty, right? Because when you have to self-generate your prayers or your words, it's like, well, I either have to make it up and pretend I'm not feeling something I am, or
absolutely,
it's very
it's a lot of pressure. That's great.
It is a lot of pressure. That's right. Sarah, so like for people who are listening, who are like, I could benefit from other people's hope, from ancient hope, from the hope of the witnesses of saints. What would be some starting points to actually adopt and experiment more with liturgy, especially in this Advent season, if you haven't had much experience with that?
Oh, there's so many resources and options. My mind is scanning like a million ideas. I mean, I think that I would probably just start with the daily office. I mean, I attend an Anglican church, and there's a website. It's just Daily Office 2019. There's morning prayer, evening prayer. There's family prayer, which is fantastic, as well as just sort of shorter versions. So sometimes we'll have the kids join. They sometimes think it's boring, but oftentimes we kind of get past that. There's a really beautiful moment. So I would probably just start there. Also, there's, there's the Pray As You Go app, which every morning I use Pray As You Go, which I love. And there's also resources, including examines for family. There's various other prayers. There's morning offerings. I love the morning offering of St. Therese of Lisieux. That's a recording on there. And I think that just finding 2 or 3 resources you really like and going back to them is a great way to start.
One recommendation is, I mentioned that we're going through this Advent series, and that Andrew Peterson is finishing up with Love. His Rabbit Room Press put out a really wonderful collection of liturgy called Every Moment Holy. And that's another resource that I've really benefited from and would recommend.
Oh, me too. It's so amazing. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Well, Sarah, tell us about going forward. What are you working on now? What you mentioned? I've heard that you're writing a new book or putting on the finishing touches on a new book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, yep. So I'm writing a book called Nervous Systems, and it releases September 2025 from Baker. So it's my second book, and I became really curious around the reasons why we're so anxious collectively. I wanted to understand something about anxiety in the body using my own experiences, but also anxiety in the church and anxiety in politics. And Curtis, the topic seems more relevant than ever when I started writing it a couple years ago. So I looked back to the Benedictine rules of fidelity and stability. And I also considered ideas including embodiment, Friedman's non-anxious presence, and then in a really exciting journey for about a year, I did Ignatian's spiritual exercises and became quite interested in the idea of holy indifference. And so the book is really framed around how we can move towards indifference, not meaning not caring, but meaning can we actually, with all anxieties of the body, of our political climate, and of the church, open our hands and say, God, I trust you so much and believe that you are good. I'm offering this to you. So it was quite cathartic to write, and I'm just in the middle of edits. So as I know you understand, those are a different kind of beast. But
That's right. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Nervous Systems by Sara Billups. Sara, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights about hope that really sets the stage for us to move into this Advent series. Thank you for coming on.
It was such a joy to be with you, Curtis. Thank you.
All right. And listeners, we invite you to come back next week where we will be going through our series on Advent. We will be talking about more virtues that follow hope, in particular, peace, joy, and love. And we will once again gather around the campfire.